This is a presentation on the major editing errors, and this is the first part of two, and I'll cover just the first few here. Major editing errors are the mistakes that significantly impact the quality of your writing. We often make errors in writing in general, but these are the substantial, significant errors. These are ones that are thought to affect a person's perception of your writing skills. In other words, if you're writing and you make these errors frequently, people who read your work will start to believe that you have a flaw in your ability to write effectively. It can also impact, studies have shown it also could impact the way people perceive your level of intelligence. Now, there's no connection between grammar and an intelligence level, so don't believe that. But when people read poorly written work with a lot of these errors, they start to think that. So you don't want people to have that assumption about you. You also want to think about when you're writing in preparation for jobs or career advancement, you want your work to look polished and professional, and preventing these errors will help you achieve that. All of these errors can be curbed through awareness of them, through practice, understanding the rules to avoid them, and just general proofreading. The five major editing errors: sentence fragments, fused sentences, or sometimes called run-on sentences, comma splices, agreement errors, which come in two forms. It can be a subject-verb agreement or pronoun antecedent agreement error. And if you don't understand these terms, we'll talk about them. You'll understand by the time we're finished. And apostrophes. This particular presentation is going to cover sentence fragments, fused sentences, and comma splices. And the second part of the presentation will cover agreement errors and apostrophes. A sentence fragment happens when you're missing a main element that would complete a thought or idea. Remember that a sentence is an expression of one complete thought. When you have more than one complete thought going on, you need more than one sentence to accommodate. At a minimum, sentences are composed of a subject and a verb. Fragments occur when one of the two are missing, and they can also occur when both of them are missing. Sometimes we write statements that don't really have a subject and verb because they're trapped. The words are trapped inside of a dependent clause, which depends on a full sentence to carry it. Most frequently, fragments occur when the verb is left out. You absolutely have to have a verb if you want to have a sentence. Sometimes fragments occur when crucial information is placed in an adjacent sentence. And what that means is sometimes we write a sentence and put a period, and then we continue with more information that really belongs in that sentence before it. Some examples of fragments. This sentence: we arrived early because we left early. And this is a case that I was talking about before where the information is in the adjacent sentence. If we have a dependent word cannot begin complete sentences. Because we left early, because is a dependent word. So what we've created there, because we left early, is dependent upon another statement that's not in that sentence. So all we have here is a fragment. To make that correct, if we took because away, we left early, that's complete. But because we left early, there's more information we're waiting for, or more information that needs to be there. So to correct that, you could really just take the period out, change the capital B and because to lowercase. We arrived early because we left early. Another example: hoping to get there on time. Now this is an example where we think we may have a complete verb with hoping, but not all words that end in ing can act as a complete verb. Hoping cannot. Hoping sets up a statement that we're still waiting for a subject and verb. We don't have that. So we have to add that if we're going to correct it. We are hoping to get there on time. Other fragments: I go to the market to see if it has fresh produce. Verbs with an infinitive form, and infinitive form just means it's to plus the verb, like to see in this statement. They can't complete a sentence. You can't use that as a verb. So you need to, again, connect the two sentences. I go to the market to see if it has fresh produce, because to see if it has fresh produce does not make sense. It's not a complete sentence. It's only a fragment. People have all types of pets, such as dogs and cats. And now this is an example or an explanation that we sometimes want to tack onto the end of a statement, and we can't assume that that's going to be a complete sentence. Unless it has a complete subject and a complete verb, it's not a complete sentence. It's just a fragment. So, such as dogs and cats, there's no subject there. There's definitely no verb there. Another example of that is when people use for example. For example typically needs to be attached to the sentence before it and give the example, unless what comes after for example is a complete sentence unto itself. Correcting this, people have all types of pets, such as dogs and cats. The next item is fused sentences, or run-ons. Fused sentences are two or more sentences that are joined incorrectly. A sentence can only express one complete thought, as I said before. Additional complete thoughts must be separated by appropriate sentence boundaries. The problem with fused sentences is most people don't understand where those boundaries are located. And some examples of that, there's no punctuation in between, nothing. So if I have a statement, exercise is important, it has many benefits, you should be able to see that there are two ideas going on in that statement. You have a subject and verb, exercise is, what is it? It's important, that's a complete idea. It has many benefits is another idea. So there are two complete thoughts that are being expressed. Exercise is important, it has many benefits. Correct it by just putting a period. It's a good option. It's the easy way out, but it's something that sometimes you have to do. Exercise is important, it has many benefits. I studied all night, I failed the test. Now here, it may be a little clearer for some people to see that you've got your I statement and another I statement. I studied all night, I failed the test. Two ideas that need to be separated out, and then we can put them back together, leaving that period in between. Comma splices, in some ways, they're sort of like run-ons. I often say that with a comma splice, at least you're trying to do something where you think there's some punctuation that needs to be, that needs to separate two complete thoughts. You just don't know exactly what to use. Run-ons, you just leave it blank. There's nothing there. It's just a blank state. It's just the two sentences fused together with nothing in between them. Here, it's where you have a comma that's in between two complete thoughts or two complete sentences. And comma splices, again, differ from a regular comma fault excuse me, in that a comma splice attempts to separate two complete sentences with only a comma between them. So a regular comma fault is not the same as a comma splice. Comma splices are a little more serious. Similar to fused sentences, comma splices are because they fail to understand the appropriate sentence boundaries. People aren't understanding where the sentence boundaries are coming in. Here are some examples, and I'm going to use the same sentences over and over in these so you'll get it. Exercise is important, comma, it has many benefits. Or I studied all night, comma, I failed the test. The comma is not strong enough to separate those two ideas. Okay? Those are two complete thoughts, and a comma alone cannot save that. So in both instances, two complete thoughts are being separated by only the comma. You have to do something different with it. So there are a couple of ways we can correct that mistake. Okay, so there are a few ways to correct the error of few sentences, and they also will correct comma splices. You can use the period, which we used earlier. We looked at that before. Just placing a period between the two ideas will do that. Sometimes you want more sentence variety, though. You don't want to have what we call a choppy sentence or choppy sentences, where they're just the same length or roughly the same statement, subject, verb, object. You don't want to separate all those with periods every single time. An option to improve that, you may want to decide to introduce a semicolon into the sentence, and we'll look at some examples. You also can use a comma and a coordinating conjunction. You could consider making one sentence dependent upon the other by using some of those dependent words, like I explained. Because is an example of that. The semicolon and a conjunctive adverb also can be added to make that correction, to correct these sentence problems. If we're going to correct with a semicolon, we need to know how to use it. If the two sentences bear a close relationship with one another, then they can be joined by a semicolon. The only reason that you would want to join these two sentences is if there is that connection. The two sentences need to have a direct relationship to one another. You know, exercise is important. It has many benefits. These two sentences bear a relationship because it's explaining a little bit more of why exercise is so important. So you can see you put the semicolon in between, and it does the same thing as a period in a lot of ways. It's separating those two ideas. It's strong enough to do that. I studied all night. I failed the test. Those are perfectly grammatically correct statements, good punctuation. Another example is to correct with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. A coordinating conjunction and used with a comma in front of them can join two complete sentences. And if you don't know what your coordinating conjunctions are, I always say remember fanboys, because if you look, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, these are the coordinating conjunctions. Notice that as well as is not included here. Don't use as well as and assume that it's a coordinating conjunction. Only work with fanboys. So in this case, the example would look like this. Exercise is important and it has many benefits. Or with the other sentence, I studied all night, but I failed the test. And you see you have your comma and your coordinating conjunction. They have to come in together. They can't be split apart. You have the comma and then the conjunction. And notice that in that second sentence, you have to use but, because if we used and, it wouldn't make sense. I studied all night and I failed the test. It's a contradictory idea here. You studied all night, so you would assume that you would have passed the test, but you failed it. The other option, making one sentence dependent on the other. By adding a dependent word to one sentence, you can make one sentence depend upon the other one. Dependent words, some of the dependent words are these: although, as, because, even if or even though, once, since, unless, until, while. If any of these are introduced into the sentence, and you have to use the logical choice, you can't just use any one at random, but if you place the one correctly, it makes that one sentence, one part of the sentence, dependent upon the other. And here are the two examples. Exercise is important because it has many benefits. Or even though I studied all night, I failed the test. So both of those being introduced create or solve our problem of not having a fused sentence or a comma splice. But notice here when the dependent word comes before the first sentence, like in the second example with even though I studied all night, you place a comma at the end of the thought. But if the dependent word comes before the second sentence, no comma will be used. So where I have exercise is important because it has many benefits, notice there's no comma in front of because. You don't need it there. And most times whenever you use because in the middle of a sentence, you won't have a comma before it. That's a most of the time rule. But if because had led off the sentence, then you would have the comma after, at the place after the statement has completed. A semicolon and a conjunctive adverb can also be used, and this some people think is a little more advanced sometimes to include. Conjunctive adverbs connect two sentences that bear a relationship to each other because they're still tied to that semicolon rule. There needs to be a connection or a relationship between the two statements if you're going to use a semicolon. The conjunctive adverb, the addition to that, just sort of pretties up the sentence a little bit. And here are some examples of conjunctive adverbs, and you'll understand. However, therefore, furthermore, consequently, instead, otherwise, then, nevertheless, likewise, and there are others that can be used. But all of these are what we call conjunctive adverbs. They always accompany a semicolon, or if you're going to use a semicolon conjunctive adverb, the semicolon has to be in the sentence for it to work. And that doesn't mean that if you use however, that a semicolon's got to be in the sentence somewhere. This is just when we're trying to combine these two sentences, two fragments, two like sentences. Some examples. Exercise is important. Furthermore, it has many benefits. I studied all night. However, I failed the test. Notice how the conjunctive adverb here is always surrounded by punctuation. Even though we're calling it a semicolon plus the conjunctive adverb, when you include that adverb, it has to be surrounded by punctuation. So in these two cases, you see before it is the semicolon, after it is the comma to offset it from the rest of the statement. And this is how it would be. Now, conjunctive adverb is unique in that it does not have to appear immediately after a semicolon to be used correctly. And what that means is, in those prior examples where you had the semicolon and then however and then the comma, or the semicolon and furthermore and the comma, a conjunctive adverb can actually float around in the sentence and be placed in other areas so long as it makes sense with the logic of the sentence. A professor that I had once said, he could determine a person's level of intelligence by the number of places he or she could place a conjunctive adverb in a sentence. It's really silly, but I think people can be creative or adventurous, I guess, in moving the conjunctive adverb around, getting it away from the semicolon. So you might could write a sentence like this: exercise is important. It has therefore many benefits. And you see in that example, I've separated the conjunctive adverb out. The semicolon comes after important. Then I continue the sentence and just place the conjunctive adverb in the middle of the statement. It has, therefore, many benefits. But you notice that it's still surrounded by punctuation. I've still surrounded it by the commas. I studied all night. I failed the test, however. Still perfectly correct. I've moved the conjunctive adverb to the end of the sentence. But notice again, it's surrounded by punctuation. Okay? even if you use these conjunctive adverbs in situations that don't require the semicolon, they're often going to be surrounded by punctuation. Even if you begin a sentence with however, the statement before it would have ended with a period. And then you have the comma that comes after it. Okay, and that's just what I'm re-emphasizing here. Notice that the punctuation still surrounds a conjunctive adverb no matter where it appears. This is the end of this segment. To continue on with agreement and apostrophes, follow up with the next presentation.